In July 1999, the French government released a report that summarized a 3-year study on all UFO reports from France and its main allies from the previous 20 years. What the study found was that a certain percentage of these reports could not be explained by traditional means, conventional aircraft, or even conventional physics. The overall conclusion of the report, endorsed and released to the public by the French government, said that for a certain percentage of extraordinary cases, the most likely explanation for these encounters was aliens. First, let's rewind back to 1976. After decades of ongoing UFO reports coming in from various sources, all the way back to the early 1950s, the French Institute of Advanced National Defense Studies, IHEDN, which is the highest agency of strategic military planning in the French government, created an internal committee specifically to study all UFO reports. And by the way, if I get any of these enunciations wrong, please forgive me. My French is zero. This committee was chaired by General Blanchard of the IHEDN and was made up of top brass generals, engineers, scientists, researchers, military, and government officials. General Blanchard's goal was to create an ongoing way to collect data and to study the most relevant UFO cases from France and around the world. Eventually, this agency group became known as the Unidentified Aerospace Phenomena Study Group, or GEPAN. The important thing to know is that GEPAN was formed by the French government to study UFOs in 1976 by one of its top generals and was ran for the better part of 20 years. This context is important because when we get down to the final conclusions of this committee, it's important to understand who these ultra high-level people within the defense and intelligence worlds in France were who came to these conclusions within the French government and military. So GEPAN was officially formed around 1976 to study UFOs. Now fast forward 20 years, when in 1996, a new top secret 12-person research subgroup was created to sift through all the best reports that had been collected by GEPAN from the previous 2 decades. This secret subgroup was called the Committee for In-Depth Studies of UFOs, or COMETA. COMETA was organized and chaired by Major General Denis Letty. Letty himself was a former fighter pilot and also head of the French National Air Defense and the French military for the Allied Air Forces of Central Europe. On top of that, he was also a 5th Wing commander and Strasbourg Air Base commander, aka he was a big dog in French military and defense. During the 3-year study, General Letty had ongoing involvement from General Norlon, the former commander of the French Tactical Air Force and direct counselor to the Prime Minister. Letty also had André Lebeau, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, in his ranks, who was the former head of CNES, which is France's version of NASA. So clearly Letty and his main supporting generals were all very well qualified and would have access to all national and military asset records from the past 20 years of anything captured or reported in French national airspace or all of Europe, with full transparency on any anomalous encounters in those reports. Now, the official COMETA investigation lasted from 1996 to 1999, and because GEPAN had studied and collected UFO cases from the last 20 years, it had a substantial database of thoroughly documented cases to examine. Fun fact, by the way, France is probably the world leader when it comes to reporting their UFO incidents and transparency around ongoing studies of the subject. When the COMETA investigations got underway, they started by interviewing only key eyewitnesses who had reported seeing the phenomena in France, but also used their powerful positions to dig up data and review the best cases that had been vetted and studied around the world. It's important to note here that they only accepted data from official sources like pilots, government authorities, official Air Force reports from France, Europe, and its allied countries. To be eligible, any incident testimony that was collected, studied, and published by the COMETA group was required to be supported by tangible pieces of evidence like radar echoes, corroborated visual sightings and tracks from the ground, authenticated photographs, documented electromagnetic phenomena and disruptions, and even included examining incidents that had reports of physical effects on plants and ground materials where the sightings had occurred. And because of these high standards for the process, COMETA assessed and studied only the most well-researched data sets and information that could be collected during the study. And there were a number of fascinating and famous sightings that were really focused in on and influenced some of the more radical conclusions of the COMETA report. And each of them deserve their own episode. Some of the more famous ones were in 1979, French Air Force Captain Jean-Marie Fartek, a Mirage 3 fighter pilot, and his wife had an extraordinary encounter not in the air, but outside their home near Dijon, France. They looked at the Air France incident of Flight 3532 that occurred on January 28, 1994. The 1976 Tehran incident where a UFO was actively engaged in a dogfight with an F-4 fighter jet. The Amaranth case that had multiple independent witnesses where nearby vegetation experienced scientifically measurable changes to the plant physiology, which took over a year to return to normal levels. There's the famous Trans-en-Provence case, where a man witnessed a craft hovering within meters of him while he worked in his backyard garden, and many others. And I'll likely cover these cases individually on this channel, as they should be heard by as many people as possible. And by the way, if you ever have a favorite sighting, incident, idea, or adventure that you'd like to see covered on this channel, please let me know in the comments below this or any video. So, after the 3-year deep dive, what was the COMETA committee able to discern from all this? Great question. Well, the real interesting conclusions were in the roughly 5% or so cases that met the strict data and documentation criteria and still could not be explained by any known or prosaic phenomena. The explanation for those cases was ultimately deduced to be, and this is where it gets interesting, they concluded that these extraordinary incidents could not be attributed to man-made or natural sources. Now let me say that again. They could not be attributed to man-made or natural sources. I mean, it just blows the mind. And again, these conclusions came after all possible explanations were thoroughly examined and ruled out. In a letter to author and investigative journalist Leslie Kean for her book, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, which, by the way, still probably my favorite book on this entire subject, because it only covers reports from extremely well-qualified official sources, many of which happened 30, 40, 50 plus years ago. So in the book, General Latis stated bluntly in a letter to Kean that the intention of the COMETA panel was to demonstrate to French officials, their prime minister, and the world at large, quote, that the UFO phenomenon is real and is not the result of fantasy. So as you can imagine, as any rational human, General Latis was astonished to realize these conclusions. So much so that he further expounded in his letter to Kean, I now know for certain that silent and completely unknown objects sometimes penetrate our airspace with flying capabilities that are impossible to replicate on Earth, and these objects appear to be operated by some kind of intelligence. Impossible to replicate on Earth, operated by some kind of intelligence. I mean, just wow, mind-bending wow. And here's another quote made in 2002 from French General Tuval, commander of the French National Air Force Defenses, referring to COMETA panel study and the conclusions, saying, quote, yes, unknown objects are sometimes seen in the skies over France, and consequently, it was our responsibility to study them seriously, end quote. From these unbelievable conclusions and their potential concerns for national defense, Latis and his generals and the COMETA panel felt they had no choice but to address the whole issue head on. What the COMETA report ultimately concluded in a straightforward manner and actually stated in its conclusions was that the most rational explanation of the phenomena was the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Right there, someone finally came out and said it. Why the is this story never told and retold by mainstream media? When it was published in France in 1999, the official report was titled UFOs and Defense. What should we prepare for? And as you can imagine, it was an absolute bombshell, caused quite a few ripples in military and defense circles. And despite the unbelievable straightforward assessments from an official major world government, and without examining the research themselves, there were several attempts from other world powers to swiftly sweep it under the rug with official dismissals of the conclusions. USA. Despite our US military and defense and intelligence agencies scrambling to squash the COMETA report, it continues to receive worldwide recognition to this day by those pushing for disclosure, because when you read the report carefully, the findings are impossible to ignore. So here we are. And I ask you, is this not the biggest story in human history? I mean, seriously, how did this not break wide open worldwide back in 1999? Why is there no open, honest, ongoing international cooperation on public UFO investigations? But we know the truth. Here in the US, we're finding out from recent bombshell revelations of the US congressional hearings about claims of the US government having secret recovered craft and reverse engineering programs. Yet there still doesn't seem to be a well-organized or well-funded agency investigating this, which, if you ask me, is clearly by design. And if you say AARO, the All-Domain Resolution Office in the Pentagon, is a legit US program, I have some beautiful swampland to sell you out in Florida. I mean, come on. Greatest story in human history, and it's woefully underfunded and a pathetic excuse for an intelligence office, if we're being honest, which is disheartening, especially when you hear General Lateef say that at the core, the COMETA group in its official report was and is a legitimate attempt to bring together some of the most powerful countries in the world, specifically the US and their European allies, to work together openly on the study of the UFO phenomena. And that's because General Lateef rightly understood that the UFO topic is the greatest story in human history. Even to this day, the French general is still mystified by the subject and wants to find a resolution. He continues to be astonished by the pervasive head-in-the-sand approach that the US intelligence and militaries take publicly. The general has even flatly said, "I don't think a powerful country like America finds it acceptable to acknowledge that something strange can fly over the country at will, and they can't clear their skies of it." Exactly. And the general even pushes harder, again telling Leslie Kean in the UFOs General's book, quote, "We are convinced some governments don't say all they know about the subject. And I mean, of course, the states. That's why we ask for good cooperation from all countries. We're willing to do the work, to work together," end quote. And to this day, there's still an open door invitation from France for the US to come work together on the UFO subject. And guess what the US response was and still is to this day? You may not be surprised to hear. And that's one of the things that I really love about the COMETA report. It really pushed back against the US government and US military policies on UFOs of issuing denials, ongoing obfuscation, secrecy, stigma, disinformation, and just a general stance of debunking above all else with a nothing to see here attitude. And this will become painfully obvious when we cover the US Project Blue Book debacle in a future episode, and see that for the longest time, the answer from the US government to its citizens has essentially been, it can't be, therefore it isn't, and nothing to see here, folks. Well, you know what? I say that. So first off, thank you, because the more people like you that watch and listen to this material, the more pressure we can apply to that dam, nudging us closer to that inevitable breaking point. And if you really want to push harder on that dam, the greatest thing that you can do, that we can do as citizens represented by elected officials is to call and write those elected officials, especially those knuckleheads out in Washington. So if you would like to help put more pressure on that dam, to help deepen the cracks that are clearly forming, then please consider reaching out to your elected officials. Because I have faith that together, with enough people pushing, like you and I pushing, we can truly break this and any other important, greatest story wide open to the public. And as I will always do on my videos, if you'd like to take a deep dive into the material from this video, I'll leave links in the video description below. I'll include a link to the full translated COMETA report, as well as some of my favorite books to read on the subject, including Leslie Kean's book. And if you want to see why the stigma is so strong, then check out the video linked at the end of this video. Until next time, thank you for watching. My name is Jason. This has been Beyond Strangeness. I will see you again soon. Take care, my friend.